continuing our topic on pollination, and today we'll be talking about pollinating agents. So now, pollination in most flowering plants is dependent on external agents. It's some external agents that carry out pollination. Now, these agents include wind, water, insects, and other animals like birds, squirrels, bats, snails, and so on and so forth. So these are the agents that carry out pollination. Now, each flower is adapted to carry out pollination based on the kind of agent that carries out its pollination. So for example, wind pollinated flowers or wind pollinated plants, they are adapted to carry out wind pollination. They have features that enable them to carry out wind pollination. So we'll talk about these flowers and the features that enable them to carry out their pollination. Now, out of all the agents that carry out pollination, wind and insects are the most common pollinators or pollinating agents. So, like I said, flowers pollinated by various agents, they show characteristic features. They have features that enable them to carry out their pollination. Now, by looking at a flower, we can tell the kind of pollinating agent that it has, or the pollinators of that flower. We can tell whether it's a wind pollinated flower or an insect pollinated flower just by looking at the flower. Now let's talk about insect pollination. Now, insects visit flowers to obtain nectar and pollen, which is their food. So the food that the insects derive from the flower is nectar and pollen. So they go to the flower to obtain that food. Now, flowers use various features like color and scent to attract these insects to them to obtain the food. Now, in the process of these insects coming to obtain their food from these flowers, they bring about pollination of that flower. So flowers usually have features to attract those pollinators. So insect pollinated flowers have features, specifically the color and the scent, to attract insects. So when the insects come to feed, to take their food, which is the nectar and the pollen from the flower, they inadvertently bring about pollination. Now, the common insects that bring about pollination are bees, wasps, beetles, butterflies, moths, and ants. So these insects are the common ones that bring about pollination. Now, because these insects can fly or crawl relatively long distances, they can pollinate individual species that are distances apart. What I mean by this is, when, for example, a butterfly goes to feed on a particular flower, let's say a flower for an example, that is on a plant that is in a far distance. So we're talking about cross-pollination of two flowers on different plants. So when a flower goes to a plant to feed on that plant, to feed on the food in the plant or the flower, it could carry the pollen grains on its body. When it feeds on the flower, then it can carry that pollen grains to go and meet another flower. When it's feeding on that flower, then the pollen grains will land on the stigma of that flower, and that way pollination has occurred. So because these insects can move distances, they can carry pollen grains from far distances. They can carry the pollen grains through distances despite the distance between the plants. So the insects will carry the pollen grains unintentionally, and they will go and pollinate the stigma of another flower or of the same flower. Now let's talk about the characteristics of insect pollinated flowers. Flowers that are pollinated by insects. Now, flowers pollinated by insects are known as entomophilous flowers. They have several features. For example, the flowers pollinated by insects are usually large and conspicuous. They are usually very visible so that they can attract the insects. And examples of these flowers include Clitoria, Stenlobium stans, and Splatogotis. So those flowers are large and conspicuous to attract the insects. Now, there are some that the flowers are actually small, like Ixora and Salvia, but they occur in large and conspicuous inflorescences. Inflorescences are groups of flowers, so they can still attract the insects that way. So the flowers of insect-pollinated flowers are usually large, or they occur in large groups, or they occur in groups that are large to attract the insects. So another characteristic of insect-pollinated flowers is that the flowers are usually bisexual. So the two sexes are found in the flower. So self-pollination can occur. And also, another characteristic is that the petals of insect-pollinated flowers are usually large and brightly colored to make them conspicuous, to make them visible to insects, so that they can pollinate them. For example, bees are attracted to blue and yellow flowers. So the flowers of insect-pollinated flowers, or the petals of insect-pollinated flowers, are usually brightly colored. They have bright colors that attract the insects. So another characteristic is that the flowers of insect-pollinated flowers are usually scented. They usually have good scent, and also they produce nectar from their nectaries. So this nectar is what the insect is coming to feed on. So they usually have scent, and they produce nectar from their nectaries. Now, another characteristic of insect-pollinated flowers is that the stamens are usually found within the flowers. They lie within the flowers. All the anthers are small, and they are either firmly attached at their bases or fused to the backs, fused along their backs to the filaments. So that's the way the anthers and the stamens are. The stamens usually lie within the flowers, and the anthers are small and attached at their bases, or they are fused along their backs to the filaments. Now, for the stigmas of insect-pollinated flowers, they are usually enclosed within the flowers. Now, the stigmas are small and they are rigid with sticky surfaces, so that pollen grains can adhere to them. The pollen grains can stick to them. So when the insect is brushing the flower, when it is brushing pollen grains or moving pollen grains, the pollen grains, once they just touch the stigma, they can stick to it and pollination can occur. So that's the way the stigmas of insect-pollinated flowers usually are. Now, what is the process of insect pollination? What does it involve? So basically, what happens is that an insect visits a flower in search of food. Then the insect becomes covered in pollen, because when it is feeding on the nectar, it becomes covered in pollen unintentionally. It doesn't even know that it's covered with pollen from the anthers of the flower. Then after that, it flies to another flower of the same species. So it could be another flower on the same plant, or it could be another flower on another plant. Now, some of the pollen that is on the body of the insect become rubbed off onto the stigmas of that flower, and in that way, pollination has occurred. So we said there are different pollinating agents. We said we have insects, we have wind, and we have other animals. So we said the two major type of or the two major agents are the insect and the wind. So the other animals also cause pollination, but they are not that common. So before we talk about pollination by wind, let's talk about pollination by animals. And the specific animal we'll be talking about is birds. Now, pollination by birds, birds are very different from insects, because birds perceive red color clearly than insects. Now, birds are also larger than insects, and they have a poor sense of smell. So they are not able to smell as well as insects. They do not even really smell. So as a result, the flowers that are pollinated by birds are usually red, and they do not have any scent. They do not smell. So they do not have any smell, whether good or bad. So they usually produce more nectar than insect-pollinated flowers in order to entice the birds. So an example of birds that bring about pollination is the humming birds. So I want to talk about wind pollination. I want to talk about flowers that are pollinated by wind. Now, many species of present-day flowering plants are pollinated by wind, and most familiar plants that are pollinated by wind are the grasses. That includes the cereals and the palms and also the sedges. So those plants are pollinated by wind. So despite this, the wind pollination is a very stressful and a wasteful process. So it's a very wasteful process because the wind can blow several pollen grains that will not eventually meet or reach the stigma. So wind pollination is a very wasteful process. Now, individual plants that are pollinated by wind produce millions of pollen grains. Now, only a small proportion of these pollen grains that they produce land on a receptive stigma. Now, in agriculture, where we have vast areas of land that are under the cereal species, that's when we are talking about monocropping, planting only one type of crop. So when we have a large area of land that we have one type of plant, like for example cereals, pollen transfer by wind is very easy, it's very efficient, and it's very easy in that kind of situation. So it poses no problem. Now let's talk about wind pollinated flowers. Flowers that are pollinated by wind, what are their characteristics? Now, flowers pollinated by wind are called anemophilous flowers. Now, they exhibit some characteristic features, like for example, the flowers of or wind pollinated flowers are usually small and inconspicuous. They're not usually very visible, but they are usually found on large inflorescences held well above the leaf. So they are usually small, inconspicuous, and they are borne on large inflorescences held well above the leaves. Also, another characteristic is that there is no scent or nectary in wind pollinated flowers. They do not have scent or nectaries. Another characteristic is that the flowers are often unisexual, with male and female flowers occurring on the same plant or on separate plants. So we have one flower for each sex, and it could be one plant for each sex or both sexes on one plant. Now usually there is an excess of male flowers. So flowers are pollinated by wind. Usually there is an excess of male flowers. Now the sepals and petals, if they are present in wind pollinated flowers, they usually pale or they are green in color. They usually have a pale color or they are green. Now when the accessory floral parts are also present, they are also green or dull colored. Another thing is that the flower structure of wind pollinated flowers is very simple. It usually has one or more floral parts absent. So the structure of the flower of flowers pollinated by wind is usually simple, having one or more floral parts absent. Now the stigmas of wind pollinated flowers usually hang outside the flower, and they are usually borne or they are found on long flexible styles. So they are also always branched or feathery, and they provide a large surface area for trapping the pollen grains. So that's that about the characteristics of wind pollinated flowers, and that is that about this video. So with that, we've come to the end of this topic, and we've come to the end of this topic as a whole: pollination, sexual reproduction. So this is the last video for this topic. So see you in our next video where we'll talk about another topic. Bye for now.